Mao Zedong was the head of the Communist Party, the man who had instigated the disastrous policies of the Great Leap Forward. But no one would ever dare hold him responsible. Mao's reputation remained untarnished. During this time, Mao had chosen to withdraw from day-to-day government. Liu Shaoqi took over.
Although people respected Liu Shaoqi, and he had great authority, he could not compare with Mao. I remember after Mao resigned as head of state, the People's Congress elected Liu Shaoqi to succeed him. We had parades to celebrate. But people shouted, "Long live Chairman Mao." Not a single person shouted, "Long live Chairman Liu."
Liu was a veteran revolutionary and one of the most conscientious and talented in the party. He worked with Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping to rebuild the country. They had to do it without foreign help. China's communist government had long viewed America as its principal enemy. Now, as U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War escalated, so did anti-American rhetoric. Relations with the Soviet Union were no better. In the 1950s, Soviet experts had helped build Chinese industry. But by the end of the decade, disagreements between Mao and Nikita Khrushchev reached breaking point. Soviet experts shredded their blueprints and returned home. Now, Liu shifted economic focus from developing heavy industry to making consumer goods. He relaxed controls on the peasants. They remained in communes, but they were allowed to make money farming on the side. China's recovery was fast. People who had worked day and night were given time off. The early 1960s were quiet years for Mao. He studied political economy. He read the Chinese classics of warfare and romance.
Later, there were more dance parties. Before, they were once a week on Saturday. Then they were increased to twice a week on Wednesday and Saturday. There was another big change. Another room was set up by the ballroom. Sometimes, during the party, Mao took young girls into this room to rest with him. He would rest for an hour or so. I think Mao got great pleasure from these parties.
By 1963, Mao had tired of political seclusion. At 70, he still dreamed of realizing a communist utopia. He began to plan the final and most revolutionary act of his political career. Minister of Defense Lin Biao became his strongest ally. In 1964, Lin published a pocket-sized book called Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong. First, it was distributed throughout the army, then in work units and schools across the country.
We were educated to love the party, our country, and our leader. Even if we didn't understand his words, we deeply believed that he was always right. As long as we did what Mao said, we were doing the right thing.
My teachers taught me that Chairman Mao was the great savior of China. and he brought liberation to China. This idea was stamped in my mind and ran through my blood.
The cult of Mao soon elevated him to the stature of a living god, all-powerful but remote. For Mao rarely appeared in public. His speeches were not broadcast. Most Chinese had never heard his voice. Liu, Deng, and Zhou did not oppose the cult. Mao personified the revolution. To attack him would undermine their own legitimacy. Instead, they quietly ignored his radical ideas. Their programs of careful economic growth were working. By 1966, China was increasingly prosperous and the world's fifth nuclear power. But Mao was more and more dissatisfied. He did not control party policy, and he felt that Liu Shaoqi and the other leaders were betraying the revolution.
Mao disagreed with people like Liu Shaoqi on building the economy. Zhou Enlai and Liu wanted to curb radical policies. Mao wasn't happy. Mao thought that curbing radicalism was wrong.
For Mao, communism could be achieved only through radical means, through continuing revolution, a never-ending process of struggle and change. He decided that the Communist Party itself, the party he had led for more than 30 years, was the main obstacle to his vision of revolution. In May 1966, Mao began an attack on the party. Through the columns of China's main newspaper, he called on young people to attack party officials and replace them with true revolutionaries. Mao Zedong had unleashed the great proletarian cultural revolution.
For the first time since 1949, our supreme leader, Chairman Mao, a godlike figure, called on people at the very bottom of society. People like us students with no work and no profession. He told us to rebel against party officials. This had a tremendous impact on us.
It was said there were people who were against Chairman Mao. We felt it was time for us to give our blood and our lives to protect Chairman Mao.
Young people took to the streets. They wrote wall posters attacking their teachers and party officials. Within days, schools and universities were in turmoil. Having launched the Cultural Revolution, Mao left Beijing. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping were left to manage the growing disorder. They asked Mao for instructions, but he gave them none. On July 16, 1966, Mao staged a huge media event, swimming in the Yangtze River. It was a signal to the nation that Mao, aged 73, was vigorous and in command. Two days later, he returned to the capital.
A meeting was held in the Great Hall of the People with students from Beijing University and other colleges. At the meeting, Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and Zhou Enlai were sitting on the stage.
Unknown to the participants, Mao was listening backstage. Dr. Li sat next to him.
Liu Shaoqi described how the Cultural Revolution started. He said, "We veteran revolutionaries have encountered new problems, and we don't know how to deal with them." Mao immediately said, I hear you. What veteran revolutionaries? You're an old counter-revolutionary. My heart sank. It was already very clear that in Mao's eyes, Liu Shaoqi was no longer the head of state, no longer a communist. He was an old counter-revolutionary. Mao had already condemned him. I knew Liu Shaoqi would have no way out, no way out.
Within weeks, Mao reordered the party hierarchy. Deng Xiaoping was demoted to number 6. Liu Shaoqi even lower, to number 8. Lin Biao replaced him.
Chairman Mao says, Marxism consists of thousands of truths, but they all boil down to one phrase: it's right to rebel.
Students banded together to carry out Mao's orders. They called themselves Red Guards. On August 18, 1966, Mao began a series of public appearances, greeting millions of young people in Tiananmen Square. Donning the armband of the Red Guards, Mao gave them his blessing.
We saw Mao wave to us. He said something, but we couldn't hear clearly. Later, we learned that he said we should carry on the Cultural Revolution to the end. We felt it was the greatest honor of our lives to see Mao in person.
With Mao's approval, the Red Guards traveled for free around the country to gain revolutionary experience. In September 1966, schools did not open for the academic year.
This was the first chance we had to break away from our parents, to do whatever we wanted.
The first morning, we were in high spirits. We sang revolutionary songs as we walked. We walked the whole day. The second day, we had blisters on our feet, and we were exhausted. Army trucks often passed us on the way. The Liberation Army men would say, "Chairman Mao's Red Guards, where are you going?" We answered, "We're going to Beijing to see Chairman Mao and to get revolutionary experience." Then they would say, "Good, our truck is empty, we'll give you a lift." We would answer, "Thank you, Liberation Army men, we want to walk to Beijing. We'll spread Mao Zedong thought and get revolutionary experience on the way." The 13 of us walked and walked for many days.
On October 1st, 1966, National Day, the rallies with Mao reached their most extravagant level.
Long live our great leader, Chairman Mao. And
Lin
long
Biao,
life
now called Mao's closest comrade in arms, led the ceremony. Mao encouraged the Red Guards to attack Western influences and to destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. Without this destruction, he said, socialism cannot be achieved. The Red Guards tore down street signs and put up new revolutionary names. They ransacked museums, libraries, and temples. They searched and looted people's homes.
At first, they took my books, together with a bookcase. The second time, they searched for money. Or things that would get me in trouble. Later, they took the sewing machine and sofa, even the desk. There was no reason for it. My children were scared to death, shaking with fear.
Groups of Red Guards roamed the countryside, urging peasants to attack local officials. They came to Wugong in November 1966. Some villagers seized the chance to take revenge against officials who for years had given the best grain to the state.
They criticized old Shu. They said, "You old woman, you sifted and selected until there wasn't a single husk in the grain. You delivered such good grain to the state. You didn't want to leave any for us to eat, did you?" Several people went up to the platform and put a tall paper hat, it was at least this tall, on old Shu's head. They held her by the scruff of the neck and paraded her through the streets.
The violence soon turned against traditional targets of class struggle, like the former landlord's son, Lin Biao.
I was tied up, hung up, and beaten up. One afternoon, I passed out 4 times. I stopped breathing. Later, they didn't even have to hit me. My breathing would stop when they hung me up. That's how bad it got. In China, fathers and sons traditionally have close ties. But now you had to end your relationship. It was really sad, but you just had to do it. After my son was struggled against for the first time, I claimed that our relationship had been broken off. Awful things would have happened to him if I hadn't done that.
Throughout China, party officials, intellectuals, people with foreign connections, former businessmen, millions were paraded and beaten in public. It is estimated that at least 400,000 people were killed.
We called him Secretary Zhang. He was the secretary at the state farm where my mother had worked. We all knew him when we were children. Once he dragged me by the ear for hundreds of yards. The side of my head got all swollen. He treated his subordinates very badly. When the Cultural Revolution came, the Red Guards and workers dragged him out to struggle with. He was not treated nicely because he'd been so mean to people. He was forced to kneel on the ground, on sand, broken stones, and glass for more than 2 hours. He knelt with a heavy board hanging from his neck. It had his name written on it, with red crosses through it. That's how someone who was going to be shot was treated. The board was hanging on a very thin wire, so after 2 hours, blood oozed out on the wire and dripped down. He was over 50, or close to 60, and he was struggled against many, many times because people really hated him. Soon he died.
The people we beat up were all hooligans and loose women whose names were given to us by the workers. I put them on a truck and told them to kneel down. I whipped them with a leather belt. There were men and women. Most were women. We beat them hard. I had a kind of animal instinct. I used to enjoy beating people.
I didn't know most of the people who were struggled against. When we heard different views, we wondered, if you sympathized with the party official, did it mean you were too simplistic? Did it mean you lacked political consciousness and couldn't see his evil capitalist roader nature? Whenever a question came up, our first reaction was not to believe the official might be innocent, but that we were too naive and too inexperienced.
I didn't think about it much. Chairman Mao called on us to be involved with affairs of state, to be active in making revolution. We felt this was revolution. Chairman Mao had said, a revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. It's not a dinner party. We had to be rough and harsh and wild.
In my class, there was a student whose grandfather had owned a big fabric store, so he was a capitalist. I heard that everyone was to go to their house to criticize him. I got there late, and by the time I arrived, the capitalist had been beaten to death. I remember that his head was all swollen and dark and bruised. I didn't look for long, and then we all left. But later I learned that this capitalist was killed after my classmates got there. Other students and probably Red Guards from the neighborhood also got involved. All those people beat him to death, including his own granddaughter, my classmate. I didn't think much about it then because this kind of thing happened a lot. But years later, I thought about it many times and I wanted to find an answer. The question was very difficult. It was, if I had not arrived late, what would I have done? Would I have beaten him? He was a capitalist, but at the same time, he was a man, an old man. I have never been able to answer this question.
By 1967, the Radical Cultural Revolution group dominated the government. Members included Lin Biao and Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. She often appeared as Mao's spokesperson and had gained great power. Her calls for violent struggle were immediately obeyed by millions of Red Guards. Moderate leaders, repulsed by the fanaticism, felt closer to Zhou Enlai. Zhou's role in the Cultural Revolution is ambiguous. He tried to moderate events, but in the end he always sided with Mao. He tried to protect people, but his power had limits. Many close to him would soon be brutally attacked.
People from the Cultural Revolution group told us to drag out Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping and overthrow them. Crowds of people filled the street. Loudspeakers were blasting towards Zhongnan High, demanding that Liu be handed over to be struggled against. It was very revolutionary, very fashionable to drag him out.
Zhou tried to send the students away. He warned Liu and his wife, Wang Guangmei, to stay inside the leader's compound at Zhongnan High. In April 1967, Red Guards tricked Wang into leaving, saying one of her daughters had had an accident. They dragged her in front of this crowd. They dressed her as a whore and repeatedly humiliated her. Later, Wang Guangmei was jailed. She spent 12 years in solitary confinement. Deng Xiaoping was struggled against and exiled to a remote village. Liu Shaoqi was attacked and beaten. He was kept under house arrest for 2 years. Then, weakened by torture and cancer, no longer able to eat, speak, or use his hands, he was wrapped in a sheet and flown to this remote prison. Weeks later, Liu Shaoqi, China's head of state for 10 years, died, naked and alone. In 1967, the Cultural Revolution entered a new stage, factional warfare. The Red Guards had never been a unified movement. At first, only students with good communist backgrounds were admitted. The millions of young people left out formed their own groups and called themselves rebels.
We organized our own Red Guards. We called ourselves the Red Guards of Mao Zedong thought. We were part of the rebels. We made armbands the same as the others. You say you're defending Chairman Mao? Okay, so am I. You're making revolution? So am I.
At first, the rebels and Red Guards clashed over ideology. Then they fought for local power. Soon, millions of workers and soldiers joined the conflicts. In Shanghai, the rebel group, led by colleagues of Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, overthrew the local party committee. Mao immediately supported the rebels. Now that the revolutionary forces in Shanghai have risen up, he declared, there is hope for China. Across the country, rebel groups responded by trying to seize power from local party authorities.
Each faction had its own weapons. They robbed military arsenals, and army units supported one faction or another. They gave their side weapons. I really wanted to have a gun.
Before and after every action, we used Mao's songs and quotations to encourage ourselves. Be resolute, be daring, overcome all obstacles, and be victorious.
They weren't just small fights. It was real war. There were ex-servicemen on both sides. They'd fought in many wars. Both sides had expert marksmen and soldiers who could drive tanks and use artillery. Several people died in each battle.
In Beijing, embassies were attacked. Rebel factions occupied the foreign ministry for 2 weeks. The violence Mao had unleashed had spiraled beyond even his control. He described the summer of 1967 as utter chaos and all-out civil war. Again and again, Zhou Enlai, on Mao's behalf, ordered the different factions to stop fighting, but they did not. Finally, in July 1968, Mao turned on the Red Guards and rebels, personally ordering them to disband. This time they obeyed, as soldiers took over schools and colleges and terrorized the students into submission.
A few people called the dictatorship team came in. The person who was declared a criminal was dragged out of his seat. Then two from the dictatorship team would hit the person's legs with their rods so that he would kneel. Then they'd handcuff you and announce your crimes. They shoved your head down. The rest of the audience would shout slogans, and you were dragged away. It was scary. You never knew who would be next.
By the end of 1968, rigid conformity and repression ruled people's lives as never before. The army, under Lin Biao, pushed the cult of Mao to new heights. People had to report all their thoughts to Mao twice a day. Twice a day, wherever they were, they danced the loyalty dance.
I was a little disgusted with the cult of Mao, and I said a few things. Lin Biao had said every sentence Chairman Mao said was the truth. I said nobody can say everything that is the truth. So I was labeled a reactionary student. At school, they held several criticism meetings against me. What was most unbearable, and even today still makes me uncomfortable, was that none of my friends would speak to me. I became totally isolated.
We heard older people talk about Jiang Qing and knew they really looked down on her. So we made up jokes. And we said the chaos of the Cultural Revolution was due to Jiang Qing, and Mao should divorce her. Jiang Qing's group heard about what we said.
For his casual remarks, Zhang Longlong spent the next 10 years in jail. At the end of 1968, Mao started a campaign to have city youth, former Red Guards and rebels, re-educated by the peasants. Millions of families were wrenched apart as young people were sent to spend years in China's most remote regions. But for some, it was a chance to start anew.
After we got onto the tractor, one of the students asked me something. I remember that as soon as she opened her mouth, I cried because it had been a very, very long time since anyone had spoken to me. Later, I told them I was not like them. I was someone who was wrong, who was guilty. But they were especially nice to me. We stayed together for 5 years. Even now, they are my best friends.
April 1969.
上长，第9次全国代表大会现在开始。
Most delegates at the Congress were radicals who had risen to power through the Cultural Revolution. Many moderate officials were still under attack and in prison. Lin Biao, long seen as Mao's heir apparent, was officially appointed his successor. Lin's keynote speech signaled a new government preoccupation with foreign relations. He denounced both the Soviet Union and the United States as imperialists and enemies. Just weeks before, fighting had broken out on the border between China and the Soviet Union. Mao and Zhou Enlai now saw the Soviet Union as a greater threat than their traditional enemy, America. They sent signals to the U.S. that they would like to begin talks. Lin Biao opposed the overtures to America. He is alleged to have plotted a coup against Mao. In September 1971, when the plot was discovered, Lin reportedly tried to escape. But his plane crashed over Mongolia.
The death of Lin Biao was a great shock to everyone. Before his death, the entire propaganda machine treated him as the heir to Mao Zedong. He had very high stature, second only to Mao. People treated him as a revolutionary saint. Now, suddenly, he was a traitor, a very bad person.
After Lin Biao died, we stopped the daily rituals praising Mao and Lin. The fanaticism faded. It was as if we had all been in a dream.
For the first time, people began to question Mao's infallibility.
Did Mao trust the wrong person? If Mao had trusted Zhou Enlai instead of Lin Biao, would that have been better? There was a vague feeling that Mao had made a mistake. But of course, no one dared talk about it.
After the Lin Biao incident, Mao looked calm on the surface. But from a doctor's point of view, I knew that his health was greatly affected. Sometimes I tried to persuade him to take medicine for his pneumonia and heart disease. He would take some and then refuse. One day, at the beginning of February, he asked me, "Do you know that Nixon is coming?" I answered, "Yes, I do." He said, "Can you get me well before Nixon comes?" I said, "Yes, I can, but you'll have to cooperate." He said, "All right, you can start now."
In February 1972, after months of secret negotiations, President Richard Nixon arrived in Beijing to begin a new relationship with China.
Nixon saw two major advantages to this improved relationship with China. First, I think Nixon always saw the relationship on its own merit. The other involved the major Soviet role in Southeast Asia. Hanoi was a proxy of the Soviet Union. Now, I think Nixon recognized that a great restraint on Moscow would be the result of an improved relationship between Beijing and the United States.
I remember that Mao said to Nixon, "After our two countries resume diplomatic relations, we will still have to curse you a little in our newspapers, calling you American imperialists. You can also curse us a bit. This is just for show, firing a few empty shots. It'll be easier for ordinary people to accept. If we suddenly say that the American imperialists are no longer imperialists and they've become friends of China, people will find it hard to accept."
We expected and frequently received diatribes for public consumption, both in the press and in the diplomacy itself. The careful issue was not to be carried away by this and overly offended by it as we attempted to achieve a greater outcome.
The outcome was an historic agreement called the Shanghai Communique.
The joint communique which we have issued today will make headlines around the world tomorrow.
这个公报啊，将是明天全世界的头号新闻。
But what we have said in that communique is not nearly as important as what we will do in the years ahead to build a bridge across 16,000 miles and 22 years of hostility which have divided us in the past.
Issues like America's role in Vietnam and U.S. relations with Taiwan could not be resolved. In those cases, both sides stated their positions and agreed to move ahead. Nixon's visit signaled China's opening to the world. Gradually, China would become an active player in world politics. As the country began to emerge from the worst terror of the Cultural Revolution, Mao turned his attention to China's peasants. Small rural factories were set up to make farm tools and process local crops. Thousands of paramedics or barefoot doctors brought free, basic health care to remote villages. Working with Zhou Enlai, Mao began to rehabilitate party members who had been attacked. Many, like Deng Xiaoping, returned to their posts. By 1974, Mao appeared in public only to receive foreign dignitaries. When his eyesight deteriorated, he requested someone to read Chinese literature to him.
I was hurried into the room where I saw Chairman Mao Zedong. He was sitting on a sofa. I was shocked. I had expected him to be in glowing health, our red sun. But the Chairman Mao I saw was pale and haggard. And he had become very thin. I thought, I have so many things to tell you. I've dreamed about you and hoped to pour out all my suffering to you. How could you be like this? So I cried. I must have looked ridiculous. With this old man in front of me. The grandeur and brilliance of the Mao I had imagined totally disappeared.
The question of who would succeed Mao dominated Beijing politics. Mao, now 81 years old, played one faction off against the other. Jiang Qing's group, later reviled as the Gang of Four, wanted to continue the Cultural Revolution. They viewed Zhou Enlai as their main rival, and they orchestrated a campaign against him, with Mao's approval.
It really shook me. I didn't expect such a situation in the party. I had great respect and reverence for Mao Zedong. I respected him greatly. As for Zhou Enlai, I loved him very much. Like many people, I loved him very much. But now I realized that the two leaders had very different opinions. I thought, oh Lord, whom should I follow? I, a party member. It was a dilemma for me.
Although Zhou suffered from the campaign, he kept his position. Many believe Mao saved him to run the country. By 1974, however, Zhou was ill with cancer. When he made a rare appearance at a dinner, the guests were overjoyed at his apparent recovery. But Zhou's health was fast deteriorating. Zhou Enlai died on January 8, 1976. Mao was too ill to attend the funeral. That spring, at the annual festival honoring the dead, thousands of people went to Tiananmen Square. They laid wreaths, flowers, and poems in honor of Zhou. The tribute quickly turned into a demonstration against the Gang of Four, and indirectly, against Mao himself.
For the first time, I felt that there in Tiananmen Square, I could be free. Everyone felt the same. At last, I found freedom there.
During the night, police removed the tributes. The next day, 100,000 people returned. The crowd was ordered to leave. Many refused.
It never occurred to me they would use lethal force. It seemed that communists would never do that because Mao had said those who put down a mass movement come to no good, and this was a mass movement.
Jiang Qing was in the Great Hall of the People, watching the events in Tiananmen. About 11 that night, Jiang Qing came. She hurried into Mao's room. After she came out, I heard her say, "We've won, we've won. Chairman Mao has agreed that it is a counter-revolutionary riot. We should celebrate."
That night, militia were sent to Tiananmen Square to put down the demonstrations. The number of casualties and arrests is not known. In July, the worst earthquake in history devastated the city of Tangshan. At least 400,000 people were injured or killed. According to Chinese superstition, a disaster of this magnitude portends a change of dynasty. It came 2 months later on September 9th, 1976.
I went over to Mao's bed. He saw me and said, "Dr. Li, do you think there's any hope for me?"
Dr. Li, 你看我还有希望吗?
I knew very well that there was no hope at all, but I couldn't say that to a patient. I said, "There's hope. We're still trying." He looked very bad before I spoke. After, it seemed his face got a little color. I felt his pulse, which seemed a little better too. Suddenly, I felt that there was no more strength in his hand. His hand dropped. I saw his eyes were closed. Then I looked at the electrocardiogram. The waves had become a straight line. In other words, his heart had stopped.
然后整个这事情就到这儿就
All was finished.
就没有办法再继续了。
马上就有种感觉，好像说
We thought at once, who could hold up the sky now?
毛死了以后，
China was such
这
a
么大个
big
中国，
country.
谁能够来把
Who
它？
could hold it up after Mao died?
到底将来我的
What
命
will
运是
happen to us?
I always thought Mao Zedong was a great hero of the Chinese nation. But I also thought that he was a tragic hero. So many absurd things had happened, and everyone was struggling in a whirlpool of absurdity. That was something perhaps he could not understand. He thought he was doing good all the time.
Mao showed us a very rare case in which cruelty, selfishness, hypocrisy, and shamelessness were all found in the same person. Although he always tried to cover his actions with the most beautiful words, I don't think he ever had any moral principles. Never, ever will I forgive Mao for the crimes he committed against the Chinese nation.
I didn't really feel anything special or feel sad. But I still think he was a great leader that the Chinese people should feel proud of, and that the Chinese Revolution should feel proud of.
China's new leader, the unknown Hua Guofeng, led the funeral ceremony.
If you showed any sign of joy, people would think you were gloating. You could not show deep grief either, because you would be suspected if you did. We put on expressionless faces like pieces of wood. We knew an era, the era of Mao Zedong, was gone, but we didn't know what was ahead of us.